Okay, so discussion board 9. Let's have a look at your questions. So our first question is from Casey. On page 393 in the textbook, it describes Kaplan's article on contrastive rhetoric. Below this, in figure 221.1, are several drawings that show patterns of written discourse. Can anyone further explain what these drawings represent? I understand a little of what Kaplan concluded, but I don't think I fully understand even after reading through the text. Okay, so these are the diagrams you're referring to. And first thing to say is that Kaplan came up with this idea using kind of very little data. His notions about rhetoric in English actually came from a style book, Macaulay's style book. And then a lot of his information about the other cultures and their rhetorical conventions came from sometimes translations from that particular language, and some kind of basic texts also originally from those languages. So the data itself was pretty impoverished. Second thing to say is that he's kind of talking about the persuasive essay. Which is a kind of one particular genre of writing. It tends to be the one that's favored a lot, especially in academic situations. And ask yourself this: how good are you writing persuasive essays? I would say that for native speakers of English, it's still a very difficult thing to do. So when we look at these particular ideas here, what was important to keep in mind is what Kaplan is saying is important, that different cultures have different rhetorical conventions, different conventions about writing stuff, right? But these representations that Kaplan has given us here, really, they look great, but they're really kind of a myth in many ways. So if you look at the English one, what it's suggesting there is that when you're writing a persuasive essay, you have a clear thesis statement, and you go straight to the point, and you support it with arguments, etc., etc. Okay? If you think about it in some ways, this notion of direct communication is a very big notion of, well, for one thing, it's wrong. And the second thing, it's a notion of cultural imperialism, as if the American notion of communication was somehow superior to all these other notions of communication through writing, and especially in terms of the persuasive essays. So when you look at the other ones, what Kaplan's trying to suggest is that there are degrees of digression. Um, so in the Semitic one, it gets to the point, but it digresses, and then it gets to the point, and it digresses. In the Oriental one, we have this notion that you actually start from a very general position and gradually get to the specific point you're trying to make. And so the other ones, Romance and Russian, are other ways of trying to capture certain digressions. It's kind of nonsense. These diagrams are really nonsensical. They look good and they feel good, but this is not. This only it doesn't capture these particular rhetorical traditions, and it doesn't really capture um, the totality of rhetorical traditions for different types of writing. Um, the point being still is that when you're teaching writing to second language learners, they are going to bring a different perspective on how to organize a piece of writing. And if you're doing persuasive essays, they'll bring a certain kind of tradition with them. But at the same time, think about this. A native speaker in English brings a particular set of conventions which are not necessarily the ones which are appropriate to persuasive writing. We spend a lot of time trying to learn how to write a persuasive essay through freshman comp and junior comp and all those other things, right? Okay. Next question. Anthony. When grading students' papers, you as a teacher will come across a wide variety of mistakes, especially in intermediate writing. What should you focus on most when grading? Incorrect uses of vocabulary, spelling, grammar, form, redundancy, too simplistic ideas. Would not want to overwhelm them with a bunch of red slashes through their papers. Should one or two areas be valued over others, and why? And I think, Anthony, you got some feedback on this. One thing to say, to bear in mind, is it's not always been shown that teacher feedback has any actual effect on student writing. It has been shown to have effect in particular situations, but as teachers, we feel as though obliged to give feedback, right? And the more feedback, the better. That seems to kind of justify who we are as teachers. But it takes a lot of time to give feedback. And here's the kicker: we don't know how effective that feedback is. There's going to be different types of feedback you're going to give depending on the kind of writing you're doing and the kind of stages at which the writing is going through. So, for example, if you are going through a process approach, it may be that the early drafts you're more interested in content rather than grammar, the mechanics. So your feedback may be upon ideas. You mentioned simplistic ideas, so you may want to give feedback which is about content and the organization of that content. As you get closer to the finished product, as you get closer to the final draft, then you may want to then give more input on in terms of mechanics, grammar, vocabulary, etc., punctuation. Another thing to bear in mind is what kind of writing is it? Is it creative writing? So with creative writing, we may want to give feedback on the ideas. And we may never get to a place where we want to give feedback on mechanics because maybe we want to encourage kind of that free writing, especially if it's a journal. One thing that too much formal feedback can do for a journal is inhibit the writer. So if you want to have an interaction with the student and give feedback, then it's going to be based upon ideas and content, not upon the mechanics. Third thing to bear in mind, of course, is that if it is a piece of writing that is going to be used by a student to present themselves in the real world, like a letter for a job, a resume, or anything like that, then sociolinguistically, we want to make the best impression as possible. So then we're really going to focus upon formal features and make sure it is not only is the grammar looked at and the punctuation and spelling, but it also that we proofread it and get rid of any kind of little things that could give a bad impression for the writer. So in terms of what you're saying there, Anthony, it depends on the writing, what kind of writing is, what stage it's at. And then that will allow you to choose the kind of feedback you want to give. James says, when utilizing a reading material to preface a writing activity, how long should the reading portion take up? Also, should the reading material be more accessible than usual so students are not constrained for time when trying to finish the writing activity? The response to that is, of course, that if you think of integrated lessons and the way we've talked about integration, that you may do a lesson which is focused upon focused upon reading. And then the next lesson that comes along could be the one that you focus on writing, and you're using the reading text as a model for your writing. So in that case, you've spent quite a bit of time upon the reading, and when you go back to it in the next lesson, you've already worked on the content and probably worked on some of the formal features, and then you can remind students of the rhetorical structure of it and use that as a model. So that's the notion of integrated material, of recycling particular material using a different skill. So the kind of answer to that is not to treat a lesson as being a writing lesson, but to treat a lesson as being a continuation of a previous lesson, but focusing on a particular skill. Sarah says, connecting readings and writing is obviously an important part of the process. How do you explain to students that the ideas need to be connected to the writing? Do you mean the reading? Without them directly taking from the writing? Yeah, I think we're getting confused with some terms here. Should this be introduced in a beginning or intermediate stage, or should it be an advanced stage area of learning? Um, I think what I'm getting there is the fact that we're using a reading as a model, as a guide, and then we want to give a task which asks students to use that model to create their own particular texts. So I think what the answer to your question is that as a materials designer, the particular writing prompts you're going to give are those that ask students to take the rhetorical structure but to construct their own particular content with that rhetorical structure. And so we're not asking students to repeat certain things, but to actually deconstruct the text, get the rhetorical structure, and then give prompts which require students to take the rhetorical structure but use their own creative ability to transform that into their own particular texts. Next question, Catherine. When teaching writing and trying to keep the prompt authentic, what sort of prompts should a teacher pose? Is it better to give students an option? Writing can also be seen as personal. How can a teacher balance the needs to correct writing while also being sensitive to a student's personal thoughts? Okay, so we talked a little bit about that. Depends what kind of writing you're doing. If you're doing creative writing, if you're doing journal writing, then you may not want to give any particular feedback in terms of mechanics, but give feedback in terms of content. In terms of the particular prompts that you're going to give, I don't know if it's a case of options. It's a case of recognizing particular structures, rhetorical structures that students will need to use in authentic situations. So that's very much, if you've got an authentic reading text, it makes it a lot easier for you to come up with an authentic writing task, which is derived from that particular reading. And that could be in terms of a letter describing yourself, which could be used for a particular job. It could be, or maybe posting something. There are many user reviews. So if your reading text is a user review of a holiday, a vacation place, or a restaurant, or a particular something you bought off Amazon, then those become the particular genre that you're going to get students to creatively reproduce themselves, but with their own particular real life experiences. Bailey asks, as someone who wants to have content that is both interesting and enjoyable for students to work with, I would love to have activities where students are given maybe a paragraph from a fictional story and the assignment is for them to write a short paragraph that is a continuation of the previous one. How do I address the possibility that students might suffer from writer's block during an activity like this? I don't think writer's block is what you're trying to capture there. Writer's block tends to describe a particular phenomena where writers who are good writers, who are regular writers, are suddenly lose confidence in themselves and are unable to write. What you're probably are getting at here is the fact that not all students are able to write creatively or feel confident that they have the ability to write creatively. So giving students a chance to finish off things, I think, is great because it does limit the kinds of creativity they have to come up with. But at the same time, you be aware that some students will find that difficult. That's why, in a sense, you need to structure that in such a way so that the task is within the abilities of the students. So there are, if there are several options to completing a story in terms of a narrative, what happens next, etc. That probably is something that students could do and feel confident about. But if it's kind of pretty wide open, that's going to be difficult for students to do. Okay, so thanks for those questions, and I'll look forward to responding to your questions from discussion board 10.